Okay. Hello, welcome back everyone to our weekly webinar. Today's topic is we're going to be discussing a very exciting one, ARSHAS, which is hemorrhoids. And I've never met such a great group of people who are so excited to learn about hemorrhoids. But as you know by now in your practice, it's extremely common. And as I was telling Hillary just a few minutes ago, is that I feel that almost 75% of our clients either fall into the realm of grahini or they fall into the realm of arshas or hemorrhoids. And whether they come in for that or they don't, but they usually end up having either one of those. So both of these topics are extremely important. And the great thing about it is in Ayurveda, the approach for both are very similar. So we're going to be talking about that today. But before we get started, on the topic of arshas, I do want to go through some of the questions that you guys sent me ahead of time so that we can get through this. And then one of the questions actually leads directly into our topic of the day. Okay, so one of the first questions we had, which was a really good one, was what is the role or effects of the Jataragni or Grahani after someone has had either gastric bypass surgery or a colostomy or a lap band? And also, the second part of that question would AMA be less or more likely to be present, or does it depend on the individual or their diet and or lifestyle? Okay, so the answer to that is in all three of these procedures, it's actually something that it's an intervention that is looking at the anatomical issue. But I had this discussion with another one of my students as well, is the fact that even when they're doing these different procedures, it's really not looking at the root cause for why they're doing the procedure. So gastric bypass and lap band tends to be measures done for chronic obesity, or extreme obesity. And in such conditions, again, it's looking at the anatomical issue of the stomach being, the capacity of the stomach being too large, it's taking in too much. So these procedures actually help to reduce the actual size or the capacity of the stomach or the actual organ. But then again, the root cause for this, or the root cause for the obesity, is not really addressed. It's just a mechanical issue by doing these procedures. So therefore, there would still be the root cause for the actual problem or pathology, which most likely, again, there is starting from Manda Agni. So in such conditions, there will still be an issue with Manda Agni. Manda Agni means it's a lower Jataragni. Therefore, there will also be a weakness of the Grahani. Because remember, we talked about this in class, that the strength of the Grahani is completely related to or dependent on the strength of the Agni, and vice versa. So if there is Manda Agni, then the Grahani is also weak. If the Grahani is weak, then the Agni also will be weak. Okay, so in both those conditions, of course, and also in the colostomy, there also, it's not necessarily looking at the Agni here, but in the colostomy, what's happening is they've created a different passage for the fecal matter to be coming out of the body. So there's no regulation for how quickly or how much this fecal matter is passing out. It just keeps flowing out as if, for instance, you would put in a catheter and the urine just flows out. So as it is produced, it just flows right out. There is no sort of sphincter reaction that is really necessary to regulate the flow of this Apanavata. So Apanavata is just flowing out. If Apanavata is constantly moving in a downward direction, there is nothing to actually stop it and allow the Apanavata to either stay in that place or to move upwards to then become the Apanavata, which is responsible for igniting the Agni. So therefore, it's really important and essential for that Apanavata to move out, but also stop once it has done its job of pushing out the waste products. So in the colostomy, that doesn't happen. The Apanavata is free to flow out at all times. And therefore, it never gets a chance to go back upwards to then create or have the function of the Samanavata, therefore igniting the Agni. Okay, so that's the reason why in all of these conditions, the Jataragni will be very less. Therefore, there absolutely will be ama, and most likely you're going to find ama in all conditions. Okay, so in both those conditions, as well, in all these situations, you're going to have an issue with the Jataragni, and you're also going to have an issue with the Grahani, and there will also be presence of ama. So the next part of that question was, can the person still take takra? Um, in the case of ama, can the client still use takra, or is it permitting the contraindications and the prakriti and all of these other situations? Yes, in this case, you probably still can take takra. You can modify the whatever ingredients you add with the takra, or the herbs you add with the takra, because again, in this condition, Agni is very less. Takra, remember we talked about it being so light and easy to digest, but it's also very nourishing. So because of that, it's a quick and easy nourishment for the body without causing the strain of actually having to further digest that to produce the nourishing effect, because it is so light and because it's so easy to digest. So therefore, if the person, most likely, though being obese and though having this gastric bypass or lap band, actually needs to increase their Agni, and also they need nutrition. So this seems contradictory because of the fact that they're overweight. It seems like they're overnourished. Why would they need further nutrition? Because in those cases, again, in this situation, it is blocking at the points of nourishment. It's not further coming down to all the dhatus. It gets stuck at the Medo dhatu, and it's nourishing only the Medo dhatu, but it's not going to the lower dhatus. If it doesn't go to the lower dhatus, then ojas doesn't get formed. So even in that sense, they need a light form of nutrition. They still need nutrition. The body cannot exist and cannot be able to function without nutrition. But the type of nutrition they need is a very easily digestible light nutrition that immediately produces that rasayana effect. It immediately gets absorbed, and it immediately starts to nourish the dhatus in the appropriate manner without adding to the excess or being targeted only towards the Medo dhatu. Okay? So for instance, even in that situation, takra can be given, because takra, instead of food, takra would take the place of food. So they would start up in that situation, taking very small amounts of takra. You can add in something like amlaki, which is a very good rejuvenator. It's a very good rasayana. It's very nourishing. But in small quantities with the takra, it is sufficient enough to provide just the amount of nutrition and nourishment that the person needs, without it being excessive nourishment and without it further suppressing the Agni and causing more ama. So you see, even in that situation, the takra has such a wonderful effect to be able to simultaneously digest ama, increase the Agni, as well as provide nutrition to the body. Okay? So that's why takra can be used even in that condition. And takra can be used almost in the extent of a meal replacement. So ideally, you don't want to do that. But in such severe conditions where there is almost no sort of Agni and there's no sort of absorption, then takra can work as a meal. Because if they were to try to consume a meal, that wouldn't actually be digested at all. It would just further aggravate the condition. And you don't necessarily see the signs and symptoms of that indigestion immediately, but it will slowly build and build and build until it gains enough strength to then manifest as an actual sign and symptom. Okay? But better than that is you can use takra. So whether it be a meal replacement for one meal or for 2 meals, depending again on the person's strength, the strength of their body, and how bad the condition is, then you can use your intuition, or you can use your logic and your inference as to whether it should be takra used as 1 meal replacement or 2, or even in very, very severe conditions, even 3. Okay, and if it was to be 3, it can be just for 1 or 2 days, and then you can slowly, gradually introduce back, again, semi-solid foods and then solid foods. This is very similar to what they do in Samsarjana Krama, which is the diet that is advised after doing Panchakarma. Okay, where they slowly increase. They start off with liquids, clear liquids, and then heavier liquids, and then semi-solid foods, and then solid foods. Okay, and that by doing that, you're slowly again increasing the Agni and providing just the amount of nutrition that the body can handle and as well digest. Okay, so that was the first question. Another question that we had was, let's see here. Does it matter if you take takra before or after meals? Is it that taking takra before meals affects ama and taking takra after meals affects the Jatra Agni or the Pachaka Pitta? And would the churning be different? So ideally, what you want to do is you want to take takra before the meal. Because, and this is for the instance, if someone has grahani, if someone has, which we're going to talk about today, is arshas or hemorrhoids, you actually want to take the takra before the meal. The reason why is because the takra acts as a sort of an appetizer. When it's taken before the meal, it gets direct contact with the ama and direct contact with the agni. If you put food in, the food has the first preference. It's sort of a layer. The agni is here, the food comes in, and then you put the takra in. So it doesn't have direct contact with the agni. Whereas opposed to if you take it on an empty stomach before a meal, the takra has direct contact with the agni, it has direct contact with the ama. So it has the ability to then start clearing off some of the ama and also igniting the agni. So therefore, again, preparing the stomach, preparing the amashaya to receive food. So whatever you eat after that can then be digested. And that's the whole issue with these conditions, is that the agni is so less and so weak that it cannot digest the food that you're taking in. So what happens is it just ends up creating more ama. So you have already existing ama, and then every time you consume food, again, it's creating more ama, and you're just going on adding and adding and adding and building upon that ama. Okay. So that's the reason why you want to ideally try and have the takra before a meal. However, if the person does not have the condition of grahani or hemorrhoids or an issue with the GIT, but it's for maintenance of health, because remember, takra is something that can be taken even for maintenance of health. Oh, so for those of you who are just joining, do you want to mute your microphones and also stop your video so there won't be feedback of the voices? Thank you. So with the takra taking on after a meal, if for instance, if you're trying to maintain your health and you don't necessarily have an issue with ama, but takra is again very good for increasing digestion or for aiding in digestion, then in those cases, the person can have it at the end of the meal. So for instance, in South India, and actually in many regions in India, they drink takra at the end of the meal. Because if you're, again, taking it for the maintenance of health, you can have it at the end of the meal. But if you're using it as a medicinal formula, where the aim is to digest ama and to increase agni, then in those cases, you want to have it before the meal. Okay? And the churning should ideally be the same. In the cases, there is a description in Bhava Prakasha where they say that you can have a difference in the quantity of fat that you remove. So in the case of Vata, you only need to remove maybe 1/4 of the fat. In the case of Pitta, you can remove about half the quantity of the fat. And in the case of Kapha, you want to remove almost all the quantity of fat. Okay, so that's the different proportions of how you can churn it according to the doshas. Because in Vata, it can use some of the grounding qualities of the curd, and a person of a Vata predominant Vyadhi or Vikriti, they can handle, or their body may need some of that snigdha, some of that grounding qualities that is there in the butter that we're taking out in the churning process. So for a Vata sort of Vyadhi or Vata Vikriti, or Vata pathology, they may not necessarily need to have all the fat taken out. Their body can handle some of the fat. So that's why in that process, if you take off just 1/4 of the fat, that is more than enough. For Pitta, half the quantity of the fat, and for Kapha, you want to remove all the fat, as much fat as possible. Okay? So that was another one of the questions. One more question we had was, would the client be able to take panchakarma to rekindle Agni? So again, panchakarma here, if you're talking about grahani, and in the case of grahani, remember if we looked at the line of treatment, panchakarma is the last resort or the last part of line of treatment. In the first part of the treatment, it is to digest ama and increase agni. That is the definition of deepana and pachana. Deepana means to increase the agni, pachana means to digest the ama. So that is your first and foremost line of treatment in grahani, and you cannot achieve that by doing panchakarma. Panchakarma comes way after you do this. Okay, so panchakarma wouldn't actually help in increasing the agni in any way. In fact, if you look at the actual procedures of doing panchakarma for a treatment procedure, remember you have to look at panchakarma here in the sense of being therapeutic and not for maintenance of health. So what we typically know of panchakarma is not the same kind of panchakarma that is used for chikitsa. Chikitsa panchakarma is the full-on, very intensive shodhana kriya, where we are trying to expel out the excessive amount of dosha. Okay, and in those sort of conditions where you are really inducing the body to expel out the dosha or to throw out the dosha, the reason I'm using these terms because that's exactly what happens. You cause the body to get so aggravated and so irritated that it has no other option but to actually projectile throw out in whichever orifice is the closest, and it will throw out the doshas. So in that process, that's actually the definition of what really happens in panchakarma. And in that process, what happens is because the body is throwing out that dosha, it actually ends up really killing the agni. The agni is almost non-existent by the end of one of the panchakarmas or one of the kriyas. And in that process, after the panchakarma, as I just mentioned earlier, you end up doing doing as a post-operative effect, you do samsarjana kriya. When samsarjana means to gradually increase. And what you're gradually increasing is the quality of food that the person takes. So for instance, if someone has done a virechana, like an actual virechana for chikitsa purpose or for treatment purposes, then at the end of that day, after the kriya is over, the first meal that they'll have is actually just rice gruel. It's the water from the boiled rice. You don't even eat the rice. You just, if you were to put rice in a pot of water and you boil it, and the water that you usually decant and collect the rice, that water, that rice water, that's what they have for their first meal after a panchakarma. Because their agni is so weak, it cannot handle anything but that. Just the mild amount of starch in that water and boiled water, basically cooked water. So that's what they have for their first meal. And that, depending on how many bouts of cleansing they had. So for instance, in vamana, you can have sometimes around 10 times the person vomits. In virechana, you can have anywhere between 3 to 10 times that they go to. So depending on how many times they've gone will determine how many meal times they need to have this type of meal. So say in general, they will have this rice water or this rice wash for 3 meals. So they'll have it for dinner, they'll have it for breakfast, and then they'll have it for lunch. That's 3 meal times. Then from there, they upgrade to the rice and the water. So that's like kanji. So that in that they will take the same rice boiled in water, and that is mixed together, and then that is taken again for 3 meal times. So they again, it will dinner, breakfast, lunch. Then the new one, the rice and the water, will be dinner, breakfast, and lunch. Then after that, you can increase to vilepi, which is rice plus a legume, usually green gram or moong dal, because it's the most easily digestible one. So you add that in, and then that's processed, and then that's added again for 3 meal times. And so this is how they increase slowly until they finally the body is ready enough to handle solid foods. And in this process, this is actually how you're slowly igniting the Agni again and giving just the amount of nutrition that the body needs. And remember, after Panchakarma, you have completely cleansed the body. So you want to make sure whatever you're putting in is not, again, going to start creating more ama, because it's very easy to create ama immediately after that. That's why Panchakarma, if you're doing for the purpose of therapy, you're doing for the purpose of chikitsa, requires a lot of care and attention as to what all the procedures, everything that goes along with it. Because it's very easy for it to go the wrong way if not done properly. Okay? So just keep in mind when we talk about Panchakarma for treatment of a disease, it is the actual full-blown, very intensive Panchakarma, and not the typical kind of cleanses that we've talked about or we hear about that's practiced. That is the sort of Panchakarma done for maintenance of health, but is a great difference between that sort of Panchakarma and that which we have, what is written in your line of treatment. Okay? And even in your line of treatment, we've described only if the person is strong enough to handle the Panchakarma, then we will do that. But if their body is too weak because of the disease, then we cannot do the Panchakarma. We need to find other measures, or we need to do something to rebuild their strength again. But we cannot do a cleansing if there's no strength. If you were to try to induce this cleansing or this shodhana when the person has no strength at all or very low strength, or there's no rogi bala, then in that condition, it could end up with some serious side effects and may even cause death. So that's why, again, Panchakarma is not something to be taken lightly, not in the sense for therapeutics, and you need to have a lot of care in how you manage the whole situation. The Purva Karma, the Pradhana Karma, and the Paschata Karma, or the pre-operative, the operative, and the post-operative procedures. All of that has a very specific way we need to handle that. And it needs, everything in the whole environment of the person needs to be controlled. Okay? Okay. So to answer the question, Panchakarma is not the ideal method for increasing the Agni. Instead, one of the other options, like for instance, any one of the 10 herbs that are in the Dipaniya Gana, that would help to increase Agni. Takra will help to increase Agni. Gandharva Astadi will help to increase Agni. Panchakola will help to increase Agni. These are all the better options. That's why I have put those in your notes. But Panchakarma will not increase the person's Agni. Okay? Next question. We have time for this one last question. So, can someone who is used to eating blue cheese be an exception for Viruddha? So, for instance, the mold is a genus of penicillin and it can be healthy. So, can this be an exception for Viruddha? To some extent. So there is two ways to answer this question. If someone is very habitual, this is actually what the definition of okasatmya is. Means it's something that is not necessarily healthy, but because of the fact that you are used to eating this unhealthy thing for a very long time, it doesn't really produce effects on your body because you're used to it. So that's considered as a unhealthy habit. It's not necessarily the best healthy thing, but because your body has adjusted to you consuming that so often, it doesn't necessarily produce such a habit. And if you are one of those people, remember we talked about the exceptions for Viruddha. For instance, if a person exercises a lot or who is very physically strong due to exercising a lot, or if you have a very good Agni, then you are an exception for even if you're consuming Viruddhahara, you still will not have the effects. In those conditions, if you fall under that category, or if your client falls under that category of being very strong, physically strong, not having any sort of ailment whatsoever, then in that case, you can have this Viruddhahara and it still may not produce the effect. However, there is a what if there as well. Because this type of Viruddha is actually considered as sampad viruddha, which is where we're looking at the quality of the food. So though we may think that, yes, mold may have penicillin in it, and we know that it does have some sort of healthy effects. However, remember when we talked about the prana in the food, and we talked about the effect of the food on the mind? This is where that comes in, because this is actually considered as putrid food. And remember when we talked about what is the definition of sattva, rajas, and tamas? Tamasika food is described exactly as being putrid food. Okay? So though we may have developed a taste for this type of food, or even, for instance, the cheese with maggots in it, where in certain European countries are considered it's considered a delicacy to have that. Though you may have developed a taste for it, however, it is still considered as putrid food. So therefore, even if you eat that and it is not producing a physical effect, it will produce an effect on your mind. And that may be an effect that you won't necessarily notice immediately. However, it is tamasika in nature, and that's something that you cannot change, because that is the quality of the food. Even if you cook that, you're still going to have the quality of that food, that it has now become putrid. So it has the tamasika quality. So if you are habitually consuming this type of putrid food, or this type of tamasika food, then it will start to increase the tamasika gunas in your mind. And you may start to eventually see that. So you'll say, I don't understand why I feel so down, or why I feel so depressed. There's no reason for me to be depressed. I don't have any issues with my family. I have a very healthy relationship. I'm happy with my job. All of these things are fine, but why am I still depressed? So do you see how these things, we think about it, and we don't think that it's so basic. It doesn't seem like this could really have an effect on our mind. But what we look at in Ayurveda is the qualities and the effects of each and every substance. And yes, we can make exceptions, and I can make you feel happy and say, yes, you can have all the blue cheese you want, or you can have all the cheese with the maggots you want. However, we cannot deny that it has these qualities. And if you have something that has a certain quality, we know, or we can assume what the effect of it will be, because those are the things that we do know, this cause will produce this effect. And these are the qualities that do exist in this type of food that you cannot destroy by processing. You cannot change that putrid nature of the food. And because you're consuming that putrid nature of the food, whether it's not affecting your physical body, but it will affect your mind. And you will end up getting those tamasika qualities, because tamasika will increase tamasika guna. Sattva will increase sattva guna. It's the same thing. Remember what we were talking about being a vegetarian. Yes, Ayurveda doesn't say, nowhere do they tell you that you should not eat these things. And even I'm not telling you that you cannot eat blue cheese. What I'm saying is, depending on just understand what the effects will be. So if your body needs meat, right? Your body is craving meat, and it's telling you need to have meat and you need to eat meat. So you're eating meat because it's something that your body physically needs, then you're eating that. However, it is going to add some of that tamasika quality in to you. If you're doing other things to balance that off and to get rid of that tamasika quality, then it will not affect you. However, if you're consuming these things and ignoring what the effects of it, this actually comes under prajna pradha, where it is willful transgression, where we are knowingly ignoring our better sense and judgment because we want to do something. And because we want to do something, we will justify it to any end that it is right, even though we know that it may not necessarily be the case. And that also comes under the case for either being a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian. So if your body needs it, then Ayurveda says, whatever your body needs to stay healthy, you take it, you eat it. However, if your body doesn't need it to stay healthy, and it is more of what you are craving, mentally than physically, then that's when it's something that becomes prajna pradha, because we knowingly are ignoring our better sense and still consuming these things because it's something that we feel we want mentally, but not necessarily physically. Okay? So I'm sorry if I burst your bubble there. But yes, you can make that choice. The good thing is we give you all the tools and we leave the choice up to you. So you can make the choice of whether you want to have the blue cheese or not. But I'm just going to give you the information as to what the qualities are. And if it's any help, I was a vegetarian for many years and now I'm not a vegetarian anymore. So I also fall into that category. Okay? Okay. So the last question that I want to get to is what actually helped to leads into today's topic. So there was a question about there wasn't a clarity as to how constipation is involved in grahani. So for instance, in our notes where I had the description or the differential diagnosis between diarrhea, atisara, and grahani. And in the last section of that table, under the grahani section, I said, during the course of elimination, the stool's consistency is irregular. That means it's sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, or sometimes there's no elimination at all. So the question was, how does that seem to go along with grahani? Because grahani is the cardinal symptom is that you're constantly passing motion uncontrollably. Okay, well, have you ever noticed that when your body, when, say for instance, if someone does have diarrhea, or someone does have grahani, or someone does have this irritable bowel and they're constantly passing motion, at one point, the body lets go of so much that it stops and it starts to hold it in. So there is an extreme of both ends. The body pushes it out, the Apanavata pushes it out, and everything is getting flushed out. And after that, what happens is the body becomes so weak, there's no nutrition. So what it does is it starts to hold it back in. So that's why there's that inconsistency of passing the motion as well as the constipation. Because notice, anytime someone has loose motions, after the loose motions is over, it always leads to constipation. Because what happens is the body actually holds it in, and the mala, the waste product there, actually serves as a purpose for creating strength, because there's no strength. There is nothing, there's no substance in the person's body after they have eliminated so much. So this is actually an example in when we talk about Rajakshma or tuberculosis in Ayurveda, where we say that even your waste products can serve as a source of nourishment. And this is the example of that. When the body has pushed out because of the weakness of the grahani, it's allowing all the nutrition to just be passed out of the body. At one point, nothing is getting passed on to the dhatus. Nothing is getting passed on to the tissues. And those are the structures that do all the work. They're the ones that carry out all the functions. So if they don't have nutrition, they have to get that nutrition from somewhere. They have to figure out a way to get that nutrition. So what they do is they stop. They physically or forcibly stop that flow, that excessive flow. And when it stops that flow, the Apanavata stays there. Then what happens is it starts to then dry out whatever waste product is there. It tries to absorb as much as it possibly can, therefore leading to constipation. And how does that lead to grahani? You have grahani that can lead to constipation. You can have constipation that can eventually lead to grahani. How does constipation lead to grahani? Because even in this case, where if your person is constipated, the Apanavata is moving upwards, the Apanavata is moving everywhere, and it affects the Samanavata, which will then, first it will cause an increase of the Agni, and then it causes the Agni to die down, okay? And that's how even constipation can end up causing grahani, or you can have grahani and then constipation, okay? So that actually completely leads into Arshas. Because Arshas, the first and foremost symptom that you're going to actually see when it starts to manifest is constipation. First, it starts off with constipation, and then it slowly evolves until it becomes arches or hemorrhoids. Okay, so I'm going to start my screen share for a second here so you guys can see the PowerPoint. Afterwards, so today's class is going to be only half of the topic of arches because it's a huge topic and we won't be able to finish all of it today. So don't be scared if you don't get all of it because we are going to continue with this. We are going to continue with this topic next week as well. And next week, hopefully, we'll be able to get to the treatment aspect of it. Right now, we're just going to go through the pathology. So that's what it is, what are the types, and what is the causative factors, and also the pathogenesis for this condition. Okay, and hopefully also maybe we can have some time to get through each and every type, the Vataja type, the Pittaja type, and so on. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to share. I have this PowerPoint, which is actually much easier for you. Okay. There we go. So what is arches? Arches in Ashtanga Hridayam is described as a condition where sprouts of muscle cause discomfort and blocking of the passage of the rectum, okay? Which is basically, it's a pile mass that it obstructs the movement and the flow of the fecal matter. Such muscle sprouts can appear in various parts of the body. Depending on the location, it has different names. So for instance, arches is the term not only used for hemorrhoids, but it is used for instance, skin tags and other sort of growths. In Ayurveda, arches is also used for that. So depending on where that is manifesting, you have these different names. So for instance, if they have a specific name before the term arches, that indicates where exactly it's located. So an example of that is nasa arches, which nasa means nose, and arches is like a muscle sprout. So if you have a growth or a sprout in the nose, that is known as nasa arches. In this context, however, when we say just the term arches, it usually means it's referring to that which appears in the rectum or the guda. Okay, and that's comparable to hemorrhoids. So in Ashtanga Hridaya, they have defined arches as a condition when the doshas gets aggravated and they disturb the equilibrium of the skin, the muscle tissue, and the fatty tissue. So that is tvak, mamsa, and medas. These are the three major tissues that are affected and that actually help in the manifestation of hemorrhoids. So notice that skin is the byproduct of Rakta Dhatu. So if you look at it, it's actually the first four dhatus are affected: Rasa, Rakta, Mamsa, and Medas. All four of these are affected in the condition of arches or hemorrhoids. So that results in the sprouting of muscle tissue in different shapes that manifests in the place of apana, apana is the rectum. The rectum is the place where apana vata does its work. And that condition is known as arches. Okay. So the location of arches in Sushruta Samhita, which we know is the father of at least Ayurvedic surgeries, or the father of surgery, as we say in India. He has described very detailed about the different anatomical structures. And in that, he has also described in detail what the actual structures and the layers of the rectum and where these arches may be located. So the rectum is divided into three major sections. The upper 1/3 part of it is known as the pravahini, and that is, pravahini is translated or literally means that which initiates the urge for defecation. So for instance, when the waste products gets to this point, or when the fecal matter gets to this point, then it's the pravahini. When it gets to the pravahini, that's when the person starts to get the urge that they need to go. Okay, so it initiates the urge for defecation. This is usually the area where internal hemorrhoids are located. So these terms of internal hemorrhoids is sort of the Western classification, and I just kind of want to give you a very brief idea. We can have, if necessary, you guys can, look it up and do a little research on the Western aspect of hemorrhoids. Most of you may already know, but if not, it's a fairly simple and easy thing to look up. Okay, but just an idea as to where these hemorrhoids are actually being manifested. So the pravahini is the upper 1/3 of the rectum. The middle 1/3 of the rectum is known as visarjini, and that is responsible for expelling the fecal matter downwards. So when it gets to the pravahini, you get the urge for defecation. As it reaches the visarjini, or it keeps going down, the visarjini is what contracts and actually it pushes the fecal matter out, okay? So, and that's where you tend to get more of the prolapse type of hemorrhoids. Samvarini is the most, the lower 1/3 of the rectum, and that acts such as a sphincter. It helps to regulate the opening and closing of the rectum of the anus, and it also helps in closing the orifice and keeping in the fecal matter in the rectum, and only lets it out at the appropriate time. Okay, so the samvarini it acts as a sphincter. It closes the orifice of the rectum, and in this part, sometimes you end up getting either the prolapsed or external type of hemorrhoids. So I will describe to you or define to you what these type of hemorrhoids are in the next slide. And the last part is the guda oshta, which literally means the lips of the anus. So they describe it as lips is because of the fact that it has this muscular action to be able to open and close. And so that is known as the guda oshta, and that's the outermost part of the anus, where the skin grows and where hair ends up growing. Okay, so that's usually the area where the thrombosed type of hemorrhoids tend to manifest. So what are the different types of ushas? Hold on. Oh, here we go. The types of hemorrhoids as per Western medicine. So this is just very general, just for you to get an idea, because somewhat of a similar presentation where we talk about it in Ayurveda, but we haven't put it in exactly in these terms. For instance, you can get a Vataja type of ushas, either internal or external. We look at the different presentations of it, but it can occur on any side or any depth of the rectum. Okay, so just for you to have a very, very general idea. The internal type of hemorrhoids, it manifests only inside the rectum. It presents with bleeding that is usually dark and mixed with fecal matter, and you cannot see or feel the pile mass because it usually happens in that upper 1/3 of the rectum. The prolapse type of hemorrhoid, it's a type of internal hemorrhoid. So it manifests on the internal or the upper part of the rectum. However, when the person is passing the fecal matter, because of the pressure that's needed to exert to actually get the fecal matter to come out, the hemorrhoid also travels down and it can prolapse and come out to the external part of the anus. So it actually manifests, and the root is internal, but in the process of defecation, it can also prolapse and come out. And then once the person has passed the motion, then it also has the ability to retract and go back to its place, depending on the chronicity and the elasticity of the structures, of the surrounding structures. Okay, so this type of internal hemorrhoid that prolapses outside of the body at the time of defecation, these can be seen and felt. It may retract back into the anal canal on its own. This type of hemorrhoid is quite painful because it is mobile, because it's moving. So what usually happens with the prolapse type of hemorrhoid is that they'll say that it's very painful on defecation, but after they defecate, it's really not that painful. Okay. So it's an internal type of hemorrhoid that prolapses. The next type is the external type of hemorrhoid, and that usually happens in the lower 1/3 of the rectum, more towards the anal canal. And manifests in the anus and can be seen and felt. This tends to be very painful and causes more discomfort because it tends to be right at the opening, right, very near, not exactly on the Gura Oshta, but right very near to it. So it's a constant discomfort. It doesn't necessarily need only the passage of the fecal matter to disturb the structure, but just by sitting, the person feels a lot of discomfort. So it can be very painful and causes a lot of discomfort. The thrombose type the next is a thrombose type of hemorrhoid, which tends to be the most painful and the most irritating because it is an external hemorrhoid. So this is the one that manifests near the Guda Oshta, where it's the external skin around the anus. And those are the ones that can absolutely be seen and felt. It's very visible. It tends to be it looks a little bit scary actually, because it can prolapse. It can actually even elongate out further. It usually also is associated with a blood clot. These are extremely painful, usually they present with tenderness, and these can be seen externally, may be swollen and turn purple or blue. These are just the types of hemorrhoids, but there's also another description of the 4 stages of hemorrhoid progression according to its location and the extent of prolapse, as well as the extent of bleeding. So depending on the color of the blood, this is an important thing to ask, for instance. When someone comes to you and they say they have hemorrhoids, and they say, you ask them, is it bleeding? So they'll say yes or no. Then you need to know what color is the blood. If the color of the blood is really dark, then that indicates that the bleeding happened internally and had a chance to coagulate and dry out, and then that's coming out. That's why you tend to have the darker blood and mixed with stool in the internal type of piles, or the internal type of hemorrhoids. Whereas the lower and closer to the anal, the actual opening, the anus and the Guda Oshta, the closer it gets to that, the more fresh the blood is going to be. And the more it is to the external, and depending on the amount of pressure, it also indicates how much of blood actually gets exuded out, and how fresh the blood actually is, and how bad the bleeding actually is. Okay, so these are all some things that you need to look at. Again, I would suggest that you guys do a little bit of homework on just the modern aspect of it. It's very similar to what we talk about in Ayurveda, but this is a good description anyway for you guys to look at and to understand the different presentation of hemorrhoids, and also that indicates the chronicity and also the prognosis of it. Okay, so this is a very, very general description of different types of hemorrhoids. As per Ayurveda, the types of ushas. So from Charaka Samhita, as well as all of the Brihatrayis, or all the 3 major texts or I could say the 4 major texts of Ayurveda, they describe 2 major divisions of ushas. One is known as sahaja, or hereditary ushas, and the other is known as jataja, or acquired ushas. So the sahaja type of ushas is something that the person is born with, which you don't really necessarily see as much. It's somewhat rare, but it does happen, and it is there. So they describe this type of sahaja ushas, or this hereditary ushas, as something that is caused due to doshas present in the bija, to the doshas present in the sperm and the ovum. The sperm and ovum is known as Stri bija, which is the ovum. That is the lady bija, or the lady egg. And the Purusha bija is the sperm, or the seed of the male. Okay, so if there are doshas, there is abnormalities present in these 2 types of bijas, or these two reproductive tissues, then that is responsible for presenting or causing this sahaja, or the hereditary type of ushas. And it usually happens when there's a problem specifically with those factors responsible for formation of the anal sphincter. So the child will be born with a deformity. So this cannot necessarily only be Arshus as itself, but sometimes there are babies born with these deformities of the anal canal, and that actually also comes under this description here in the classical text. So they were very aware of, they may not have termed it as genes or DNA, but they were aware that if there is an issue with the quality of the bija of the father and the mother, then that can definitely cause an effect in the fetus and in the child, and therefore the child would be born with that issue. Okay, so the vitiation or the abnormalities in the bija can occur due to inappropriate diet, that is due to inappropriate ahara of the father and or the mother, or there's another reason this can happen. It can be due to sinful acts in the previous life. So they didn't not necessarily specify, but this is kind of the aspect of where astrology comes into Ayurveda, where they look at certain things that may be in your chart, that, for instance, you have certain issues that's weighing down on you even from the time of birth, and that's the reason why a lot of, certain babies are born with conditions that we can't necessarily explain. I mean, they've only been around for a few days or a few months, but they have these very severe conditions and pathologies, and the pathology has nothing to do with their doshas and what they're eating and them acquiring this, but it has to do with other causative factors, and those causative factors can be from these hereditary issues. So the first type they describe is the Sahaja type of Arshus. The next type of Arshus is the Jataja type of Arshus, and those are known as the acquired type of Arshus, and that's typically the ones that we are going to see. Okay, so Charaka has described, first, there are two ways to describe the different presentations of that. The first description of the type of Jataja Arshus is Shushka, which means dry, and Ardra, which means moist or exudative. So dry Arshus or dry hemorrhoids are usually caused by Vata and Kapha. And the moist type of Arshus, or that which has an exudate, or that which basically, it's not just the exudate of bleeding a lot, but also sometimes it's associated with a certain type of mucus or a certain type of fluid discharge. So those type of Arshus, that which is moist, or hemorrhoids that are very moist or have an exudate, is caused by Pitta or Rakta. Okay, that's one classification. The next classification, or different types of Arshus that can be acquired, is according to the predominance of doshas. So that is Vataja, Pittaja, Kaphaja, Sannipataja. Sannipata means the combination of all three doshas, and Raktaja. Okay. So next is the causative factors. So this is great because in the classical text, they have given us a very detailed description as to all of the different causative factors for the presentation of Arshus, or for Arshus actually being manifested. Oh, sorry. So the presentation of Arshus, what can cause Arshus in our diet, different things that we consume. And this is great because we're going to see this a lot. So the first description is consumption of foods that are heavy, sweet, cold. Abhishandi, hopefully you have heard this term quite a bit now. Abhishandi means that which causes obstruction of the channels. Vidahi, which causes excessive burning sensation. And Viruddha. See, here it comes up again. Viruddhahara is a causative factor for Arshus. Okay, that's why a lot of people have this. A lot of people consume these different types of foods, and we don't think that, oh well, I don't understand why I have piles. I'm not really a constipative type, or I don't really have too much of issues with digestion. I mean, I eat normally, I eat really healthy, but for some reason I I've developed piles, and I've had it for years now, and it doesn't seem to go away. So I kind of just ignore it. But now if we look into the details of what their diet and lifestyle is, we can trace it back to exactly what the causative factor. What is the root cause for the person developing Ushus? Okay? So though, again, we think that Viruddha seems to be very, we can't stick with those rules, or it really limits us as to what we are eating. There's a reason they came up with and they told us all of these combinations that are not good for us, because if we consume that, it is going to produce these effects. Okay? So examples of Vidahi type of food is, for instance, things that are like a lot of hot chili foods. Those are all things that would be considered as, in terms of piles, the same for it. Yes, piles is the same term for Ushus. Yes. Okay, so the next description of that in our diet that can cause Ushus: intake of food before the previous meal is digested. Okay, there's the reason why, and I'm kind of giving away the secret of one of the later slides, is that the causative factor for Ushus is the exact same causative factor for Grahini. Okay, the Ushus also manifests because of Manda Agni. And you would think, how could that possibly happen? The reason why is Manda Agni, the difference in Grahini and this is Grahini, it's because of the actual Grahini that is supposed to hold in the food, that's letting the food out. That's why you have excessive bowel eliminations. In Ushus, you still have the Manda Agni, but the Grahini may not necessarily be affected. However, even in this case of Manda Agni, it is Manda Agni that is affected because of the Vata. Okay? It's not Manda Agni because of anything else. It's Manda Agni because of the Samana Vata and the irregularity of the Samana Vata. That's why the person has a low Agni, and therefore that's causing this issue of constipation, gas formation, and then therefore the more chronic buildup of it, leading to Ushus or hemorrhoids. Okay, so I'll explain that in more detail in a second. But the main causative factor, if you look at all of these actually suppress the Agni, or they're difficult to digest and they create ama. Okay, so intake of food before the previous meal is digested, that will cause ama, and that will also further suppress the Agni. Intake of very less quantity of food. So for instance, if you have a very good Agni or a strong Agni and you're not consuming enough food to satisfy that Agni, that also what happens is it burns the food. It actually incinerates the food, and so there is no nutrition left in that food. It just becomes, when you incinerate something or you burn something, it becomes charred, it becomes dry, it becomes hard, and therefore that is not something that's producing or giving any nutrition to the body, and it just ends up sitting there in the colon waiting to be passed out. Okay, so even consuming very less quantity of food can lead to Ushus, and this is something that you're going to notice a lot. For instance, we have two different types of patients. We get patients or clients who consume too much of food, and they consume a lot, and it's overnutrition that's causing their issue. You also have the other type that are undernourished. They don't consume enough food according to their activity, and they feel that, oh well, I'm actually trying to lose weight, or I want to be healthy, so therefore they starve themselves or they eat very less. And that also can cause, we know, eating very less can cause aggravation of Vata, can further suppress your Agni because your Agni rises and then dies. And therefore, that can again create more Vata aggravation and more gas production, and therefore constipation, and therefore Ushus. So does that start to make sense now? Why somebody who eats very less amount of food would end up with an issue of piles? Hopefully you're all getting a little bit of an aha moment. Okay. So the next one is intake of unwholesome food, which is asatmia, foods that the person is not necessarily very used to and is very difficult for them to digest. That also can be one of the causative factors for ushas. Intake of meat of cattle, fish, pig, buffalo, goat, and sheep. The reason they have singled out these ones is because these are very heavy to digest type of meat compared to other types of meat. So, and it's not just consumption once or twice; it's habitual consumption of these type of foods that can cause. Again, it can really lower the agni and the digestive capacity, and therefore lead in the same process, in the same manifestation, eventually to ushas. Consumption of dried, putrefied meat or that of emaciated animals. So, for instance, dried meat like dried fish, that's probably not a good idea. It's not to say you can't have it like once in a while, but there are certain cultures and there are certain places or people who have that habit of eating a lot of dried type of meat. Jerky is a great example of that. That again would cause ushas or hemorrhoids because again it's too dried and it's actually sort of difficult to digest. So that from both sides, it's not helpful at all. Or even emaciated animals. If the animals are emaciated, they naturally have more vata. And if we are consuming the meat of those type of animals, that also aggravates the vata in us. So therefore, that would eventually lead to ushas. The major dosha that is involved in this condition is actually vata. You may have representation of all the other doshas like the kaphaja type or the pittaja type or the raktaja type. However, the major dosha that is involved in here is vata because it is being manifested in the vata domain or the vata region of the body. Okay, so it is primarily a vata issue that also can manifest in different methods or different ways according to either the prakriti of the person or also the vikriti of which dosha is more predominant in that person. Okay? That's why you get an array of different types of diets that will still cause mandagni, that will still end up with ushas. It doesn't only have to be the vataja type of diet that will cause ushas, but even kaphaja type of diets that cause mandagni can also cause ushas. Okay, or even the pittaja type of diet that causes too much of aggravation of the agni part of pitta, not the water type of part of pitta. Here it's the agni part of pitta that is too much that causes ushas. Okay? So consumption of milk, whey curd, rice pudding, and sesame with jaggery. This is a great example of things that actually would aggravate kapha, but also not only aggravating kapha, but also very heavy to digest. So it's not just consumption of milk sometimes, it's habitual consumption of large quantities of milk or habitual consumption of the whey curd or rice pudding or jaggery and sesame. All of these are heavy to digest and therefore it will increase kapha. It will also suppress the agni. It will create ama, and therefore this would be an example of what would lead to a kaphaja type of ushas. Okay. Consumption of sugarcane juice, dried vegetables, germinated pulses, freshly harvested corn, and cereals. So sugarcane juice actually is very heavy to digest, even though it's a juice, because it's high sugar content. It's good for you. I mean, it's a nice healthy drink, but it is heavy to digest, and it does suppress your agni. So that's why that can also lead to ushas. Dried vegetables, because you have actually taken out all the nutrition and it aggravates vata. Germinated pulses, because when you're germinating a pulse or when you're creating like sprouts, that actually is a new formation. So anything that is newly being formed or being transformed, it actually is heavier to digest than that which is old. New is heavy, old is light. So the germinated pulses are heavy to digest. Freshly harvested corn and cereals. They always say that any type of grain or cereal that is newly harvested is also hard to digest. That's why typically this again is a tradition in India. When they harvest different types of grains, they store it, and usually after it has been stored for at least about a year, only then will they use those grains, because the storage process, the time that passes by, actually dries out the excessive moisture in that, and that's what converts it from heavy to digest, or with the heavier qualities, to easy to digest. Okay, so freshly harvested corn and different types of cereals, those are heavy to digest, will again suppress the Agni and cause ama. The next one is a very big important one, which we are going to come across a lot, and which you all have probably already come across a lot. Consumption of uncooked raw vegetables. So I put in raw in brackets, but the word uncooked is there in the Sanskrit verse. And the reference for this I will tell you. So if you do not believe me, you can look it up. The reference for this is Charaka Samhita, Chikitsa Sthana, chapter 14, verse number 9. Okay? And in that, they have used the exact term of Shaka Raga Harita. Harita means it's green leafy vegetables. Okay? And that which is uncooked, can cause the increase or suppression of Agni. It is too heavy to digest, and therefore that will lead to Ashas. So therefore, the lovely misconception of taking juices or a juice cleanse will eventually lead to drying out of their colon, and will also eventually lead to Ashas. The more they do it, the more they will be heading down that way. So you notice, like, for instance, there was a great example in one of our other classes where they said one of the students was sharing their experience of doing a juice cleanse. He said, at first I feel really great, but then I didn't realize, I wanted to know why I was getting so gassy. And then all of a sudden I feel really bloated. And, I would think that after taking all these really healthy green leafy vegetables and juicing that juicing would be awesome and I'd feel so great. And I did. I felt lighter, but I also felt gassy. So you see, the lighter and the gassy, which qualities are those? Those are nothing but the qualities of Vata. Because what that does is it suppresses the Agni, and it is specifically also aggravating Vata. Okay? So the raw vegetables, not a good idea. And this is exactly the reason why. Like I said, in our classical text, they have given us all the information. It's just that we tend to ignore it and not necessarily think, oh, eating this is not a big deal. It's okay. You can give a little, or you can splurge. But if we habitually do that, it is going to eventually manifest as one of these conditions. Okay, pickles will also, pickled vegetables can also cause Ashas. Heavy fruits, an example of that would be, for instance, mangoes. The really sweet mangoes, they're actually kind of heavy to digest. So even though they're a little bit hot in potency, but they are kind of heavy to digest. So that's just one example of a heavy fruit. That anything that will suppress your Agni, that will cause it will cause ama. It will also cause the blocking of the shrotas, and it will also cause Ashas. Okay. Meat with fat. So for instance, like steak with those, what is it called, veins, or where you can see the ribbed, you can see the fat in it. I know most people are probably like, you, but we're going to, it's not just necessarily our preference, but we're going to see clients who consume these type of foods. So that is another reason or another causative factor for ushus. Stale, again here, stale and putrefied food is another reason for ushus. All of these will result in reducing the power of Agni and accumulation of excessive waste in the Pakvashaya. Or remember, the Pakvashaya is the colon or the domain for Vata. Okay, so this is just an example of some of the diet aspects. Next is the example of the lifestyle aspects. Here, hold on a second. Here you go. The lifestyle aspects that that can also cause ushus. It's not just the food that we eat, but even the things that we do. And we know that, you know, how much of our activities actually has an effect on our health. So for instance, excessive snehana not followed by appropriate shodhana or elimination therapy. So if someone is taking a lot of ghee and they're thinking, oh, this is really good for me, I heard that ghee is really awesome and I'm going to drink a lot of it, then, you know, if you're overdoing that, that also can really kill your Agni. And if you're not eliminating all of that snehana that you're doing to you're accumulating in your body, then that will eventually lead to really getting rid of your Agni altogether. Wrongful application of Vasti Karma, improper insertion of the enema nozzle. So here it's an actual physical abrasion or a physical damage of the structure that can cause also the ushus. So for instance, if there's too much pressure or if there's abrasion of the actual anal canal while trying to do Vasti, this it can cause ushus. So this is an exact example of a Vasti Vyapat, which is a complication or a side effect of improperly administered Vasti. Okay? Lack of exercise. Hold on, let's see here. Would hereditary include in newborn? I believe so. I will check up and let you know. So so here, this is a great example. Lack of sexual activity as well as too much of sexual activity, and also lack of exercise. If there's lack of exercise, it's not increasing the Agni, it's too much of Kapha predominance there, where you're just building more on Kapha, and that also can cause the Agni to be less and therefore producing ushus. And also lack of sexual activity. For instance, if someone, remember we talked about brahmacharya being a pillar of life, and that it's a natural urge that should not be suppressed. So if someone has this natural urge, whether male or female, and they are suppressing that urge and not expressing that urge, then that also causes a buildup that, you know, it's not being expressed out. And that can cause, again, remember, anything that needs to be expressed out is basically the Vata moving out, okay? And if Vata doesn't get to move out, then when you're blocking that flow or that movement of Vata, that just causes it to be further aggravated. It's the same thing when there is too much of sexual activity, because there is too much flowing out of Vata. So Vata is very complicated that way. We can't block it from moving, but that we can't have it moving out too much either. It always needs to be in a balanced state, not too less and not too much more. Just right, just in the middle. So in both of those situations, Vata would get aggravated, and therefore it can cause hemorrhoids. And the reason why it would cause hemorrhoids is because all of this activity is situated exactly in the same area, in the Vata domain, and in the same area where all of these flowing out and expression of these emotions is happening. So that's why it can cause hemorrhoids. Sleeping during the daytime, that's again because that causes suppression of the Agni. It causes Manda Agni. Okay. Habitual use of comfortable seat or a sedentary lifestyle. This is an example of a Kaphaja sort of a kaphaja sort of causative factor that again causes mandagni and therefore ashes. Use of vehicles that are rough with hard seats. So in the traditional aspect, in the classical text, they talk about, for instance, sitting on a bull cart and going down, a path that is very bumpy, and therefore you're sitting on something that is constantly bumpy, and that's causing more pressure on your perineum, and that causes ashes. But there's modern examples of that. So for instance, riding on a bicycle with a hard seat. And I actually have a client where this has happened. She's wonderful. She's very athletic. However, she rides her bike every day for at least around 15 miles. And it's one of those hard seats. And riding that much every single day is going to help. It really has caused her to have ashes, and she has a very mild version of it. She has internal ashes, but she has it. And the main causative factor for that is exactly the riding of the bicycle. There is no other reason. She's a very healthy person otherwise. There's no other causative factor that I could have found for her having ashes, but this was the only reason why, where it is an actual physical damage of the tissues. Okay? Frequent application of cold water. The reason why this happens is because, first of all, the cold water aggravates vata. Also, what happens is if you're constantly applying cold water to the perineum, that actually causes it to retract, and that retracting issue of where it's immediately trying to hold back the heat inside the body, it's exactly in that Gudha Oshta, that sphincter that immediately reacts, and when it reacts, it tenses up the muscle. It tenses up that area, and that's why it damages those tissues, it damages those structures, and that can again cause it to become more hard, and therefore creating ashes. Okay, use of abrasive materials for wiping. So I don't know, maybe that applied for long ago. Who knows? Maybe people camp a lot and they use a lot of different types of leaves if they don't have their toilet paper with them. But use of abrasive materials for wiping the perineum or that area, that can also lead to ashes. Continuous strain and force for elimination of feces, urine, and or flatus. That is a really, really common one, because you get both instances where you have one person who is either suppressing their urge for passing flatus or defecation, and you also have the other issue where people who are forcing. And you find this a lot with people who are more in the elderly age, like from not necessarily elderly age, but they are past middle age. So for instance, like 55, 60 and above, they're entering into that vata stage of their life, and they feel that they need to put more pressure in order to eliminate feces, in order to pass motion, or in order to pass urine, or sometimes even to pass flatus, to be able to let that gas go. And the reason why you need to, typically, why would you need to put pressure in order to release gas? That doesn't make any sense at all. But if those sphincters, remember I told you about the cold water, if they are constricting and becoming hard, what actually happens is that structure itself becomes rigid, and therefore it's not even able to allow or freely open to allow something as simple or as minute as gas to come out. So in even passing gas becomes a difficult procedure. It becomes something that you need to force out, because what you're forcing that sphincter to open. You're forcing that Gudha Oshta to open to allow the gas to come out. And it happens the same thing with the fecal matter and the urine. And that typically can happen because, again, either they're causing the strain or they have done something else that has caused that sphincter to become hard, and therefore they need to strain. Or the suppression of natural urges. That, again, remember we talked about this in the class, is that suppression of the natural urges will cause an aggravation of vata, because any urge that you have is vata that is initiating something that needs to flow out. And if you're stopping that flow of vata, vata gets aggravated. Okay? pressure, and so the next one is specifically for women. So even then they knew that if a woman is pregnant, naturally they are going to be more prone to getting piles and having constipation. So the pressure of a pregnant uterus can cause hemorrhoids. Abnormal deliveries, because abnormal deliveries and miscarriages. The reason why is because even in those conditions, there is an aggravation of vata. It's not, the vata hasn't flown out. Remember, apana vata is responsible for release or expulsion of fecal matter, of urine, as well as garbha, as well as the fetus. It also has that function. So if the apana vata did not get a chance to do the proper normal flow out or function of pushing out the fetus, then those abnormal deliveries will also cause the vata to be further aggravated. And in the same situation in a miscarriage. So by these factors, apana vata gets aggravated and there is accumulation of waste in the colon, and this results in the increased pressure resulting in the pile formation. Okay? Oh, hold on. So, the samprapti. The samprapti. Here, hold on a second. I think we have some questions. Okay. So we'll just quickly go through the samprapti. I think I have only 1 or 2 more slides. And then next time we'll get to the different types and the treatment, the line of treatment. Because the line of treatment, there are multiple different things that can be done. But for our scope of practice here in the US, we would only be allowed to do one of the different methods. Because the 4 different methods for line of treatment is actually either with medicines or by doing kshara karma, which is application of alkalis, or agni karma, which is cauterization, or shastra karma, which is surgery. So in Ayurveda, this is actually directly from Shushruta, because he does advise surgical procedures. And we have a very nice, I've done it quite a few times, but just to let you know, but that's out of our scope of practice here. Our scope of practice here is only for using different types of medication. So that is one of the first forms of treatment for this condition. Okay? So the pathogenesis or samprapti of Ushas, it's a wrongful diet and lifestyle, which we have just gone through the list. It then results in manda agni, and that causes the food to be undigested, because remember we talked about how manda agni is responsible for the food not being properly processed. You're not getting a good ahara rasa, so it is not digested. When it is not digested, it causes abnormal absorption from that not properly formed ahara rasa, and also for formation of gas. That causes further vitiation of all of the doshas, and it results in constipation. It also results in apana vata that moves upwards, because in constipation what happens is the mala or the waste product is actually sitting there and it's not moving out, and it's getting dried up even more. The apana vata is drying it out more, and the apana vata starts to move upwards, and it starts to aggravate all the subdoshas of vata. Okay, that further aggravates pitta and kapha in their domain, and it further causes that, again, causes weakness of the agni and straining to pass fecal matter, because again it's constipated, you're straining and you're pushing and you're trying to get the fecal matter out, and that's how you end up with the formation of a pile mass. Okay, so typically in almost all conditions where the person has a pile mass, there will definitely be at one point or another a bout of constipation. And that's the first and foremost thing to ask, is if they have been constipated or if they were constipated. Sometimes, they could have been constipated way before, and then it has led to grahani, which now we can see that the causative factor for both of these is basically the same thing. It's an issue with the agni. That's why even in this condition as well, takra is considered one of the best treatments, which seems very funny, because you're using takra for when there's too much elimination, and you're using the same thing when there is no elimination. But in both conditions, the root cause for it is Mandagni. Okay? And because the root cause is Mandagni, that's why Takra works in both conditions. Takra works directly on the Agni, so therefore it's useful in Grahani as well as it is useful in Arshas. Okay? So in most cases where there is Arshas, there will be a presentation of constipation and gas. So here again, digestion or pachana is the key. The key point here for Arshas or formation of Arshas, it starts again with the Agni. And here you can see that it is the four major tissues, or the first four dhatus that are directly involved in the formation of Arshas. However, don't forget, if these four are involved and these four are vitiated, then depending on the chronicity, it can then affect all of these as well. And in the process when we talked about it, you can see how it is affecting all of these as well. And obviously, anytime there is any vikrati or any pathology, it is going to lower the person's ojas. Okay? So, yeah, let's just quickly go over this. So the Purva Rupas or premonitory signs and symptoms, of course, weak Agni, indigestion, weakness of the thighs, twisting pain in the calves. That is because of aggravation of Vata. So restless leg syndrome is again another indicator that they may have this problem as well. Either they have restless leg syndrome and they have constipation, or they got constipation first and that leads to restless leg syndrome. For us, restless leg syndrome isn't a different disease. It is nothing but an issue with Vata. Okay? Dizziness, weakness of the body, either diarrhea or constipation. And now you can see why you can have a presentation of both, because both are caused because of Mandagni, right? I hope that is kind of clear now, or that's starting to make a little bit more sense. Because in both issues, the root cause, it first started with whatever ahara vihara we've had that has causes Manda Agni, and therefore it has trickled down to affecting the apanavata, affecting the gas formation, the constipation, and therefore the Arshas. Okay? Accumulation of gas, moving around, the feeling of it moving around the umbilicus, associated with pain, intestinal gurgling, and a distension of abdomen. And this is a very, very common sign and symptom that you're going to see in almost all of your patients. So whether they fall under Grahani or whether they fall under Arshas, this is the one thing you're going to find across the board. We get almost, I have to say, almost all the clients I have seen have at least one of these signs and symptoms of this one line. Accumulation of gas, the movement around the umbilicus, the pain, the intestinal gurgling, or the distension of abdomen. Okay? And that also is, there's cutting pain in the anus, or release of flatus with pain and difficulty, which we just talked about, emaciation because there's lack of nourishment, or too much belching. Too much belching is too much of the vata moving upwards. Large quantities of urine and little quantity of fecal matter because there's more amount of absorption of the moisture, and also little quantity of fecal matter is because all the nourishment is being taken out of the fecal matter, so the actual bulk of it is very less. It's being dried out, so it's very less. And also very less comes out because it's painful. The person, even though there may be actual waste product that's accumulating in their colon, they're not able to eliminate it out because it's too painful. Okay, large quantities of urine and little quantity of fecal matter, feeling of hot fumes coming out of the anus and the body, and that's because the vata is, remember, the apana vata gets aggravated, move upwards, and starts to aggravate all the different subdoshas of vata, therefore also increasing the samana vata here, aggravating it, not increasing the agni, but increasing the samana vata, and therefore making the person feel like there's heat. This is how it aggravates pitta, but does not increase the agni. Okay? So they feel like there's hot fumes all over their body, increase of acidity because it's increasing the pachaka pitta there, pain in the head, back, and chest, and that's again the upward movement of vata. weakness of the sensory organs, anger, and feeling of unhappiness. Okay, so this is just some. Here we go. Can you see me guys? Can you guys see me again? Yes. Okay. So this is just a quick description, a very quick description of Usha so far. We are going to pick this up and continue in the next webinar next week, because there's still a whole section where we need to then look at what is the Vataja presentation, the Pittaja presentation, and the Kaphaja presentation, and then therefore what is the line of treatment. So like I briefly told you, the 4 methods for treating Ushas is either through medicine, or application of alkalis, or cauterization, or surgery. However, since we cannot do the later 3, the first one, which is by medicines and different sort of combinations of herbs, that we can at least help. So that really depends on the stage, or how severe or how chronic it is. But the medicines can absolutely help. And for the most part, we're going to end up getting some of the earlier stages. So in that, we can definitely make a difference. Medicines can help even in very chronic cases, but it just takes a much longer time. Okay? Okay. So I know we didn't get a chance to go through too many questions for this part, but that's okay. If you have questions, feel free to write them down. We are going to cover more because we haven't completed this topic yet, but feel free to write down your questions for what we've gone through so far, and we're gonna continue, and we'll be able to get to those questions afterwards. Okay? Okay then. So good night, everyone, and I hope you were able to enjoy the session and understand quite a bit from it. And if not, if you're confused, don't worry about it. We will get to all your questions, okay? And soon I will be setting up the Google Calendar so everyone can put in their times for when they want their 1 hour.
Hey, Anusha, can you end with a question that the others can answer? Just one that.
Let me pick out a question here for you. Okay. What are the 3 factors that are affected? What are the 3 factors that are affected in the manifestation of Ushas, or the manifestation of hemorrhoids as per Ayurveda? This we talked about in the introduction part of the section. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.